Today's tutorial is a really cool one. We're going to be playing with more particles in Cinema 4D 2025, and we're going to be making these cool kind of sandy vortex swirly things. I don't really know what to call them, but you guys have been absolutely loving my tutorials in the new particles in Cinema 4D, and a lot of you actually preferring it over Xparticles because it's accessible to so many more of you. And these renders were something I really wanted to hash out and figure out and nail properly, because it really has that kind of Xparticles feel. It has a really grand scale to it, and it's definitely an expansion of the last tutorial. In fact, all of these tutorials at this point are connected, so I'll make sure they're in the description. If you've not seen those tutorials and you're just finding this, then make sure to go to those tutorials as well. I've got a couple of setups to show you today, a couple of different things, and it's going to be quite familiar if you have followed the other tutorials. We've got a couple of different setups. There's a lot we can do here. You've got this main kind of sandy vortex. We've got some with color, and I even did one with my logo behind it, and then we've kind of got some where I'm going to show you how to eliminate the ring in the middle as well if you want it more thick, and a couple of other setups as well. But I will warn you, these particles are very, very heavy and can be a bit difficult to work with, but I'm going to show you some of the workarounds and we're going to tackle all of that. So we'll get straight into it. But I have an offer for you first. All the project files from the tutorials this month are going up in the Patreon, along with more tutorials expanding on the stuff we've been going over. If you sign up to the Patreon, the project files will be free and you can get all of them under the sign up price. So what I'm going to do is, for the first 5 people that go to the link in the description, they're going to get my Patreon for free for a month. If you missed that and you don't make it in the first 5, the first hour for after this tutorial goes live, you can get 50% off any tier on the Patreon with the code SWIRL, because this is kind of like swirly particles, right? So if you use the code SWIRL and you miss the first 5 that you don't get for free, you can still get in for 50% off for the first hour after this tutorial goes live. So make sure you go and claim that while you can. And with all that being said, let's go make these cool renders. So coming into making these renders, I'd made setups previously to this in stuff like Xparticles, and I really wanted to figure out how to do it in these new particles, and I knew it would be possible. So definitely as an expansion of the last tutorial, this is quite similar. So what we're going to do is drop in a mesh emitter, and it seems like it's quite complex, but it's actually, at the root of it, pretty damn simple. So we're going to drop in a mesh emitter, and then we're going to grab a plane. And like I mentioned, there's going to be a couple of setups that we're going to go over, but right now we're just going to use a plane. Let's set the width of the plane to, I don't know, 1500. Let's set the height to like 800. In fact, we can bring this down to like 1400, 1200 maybe for now. So we've got this big plane. And what we're going to do is basically emit particles off of that plane. So we can drop the plane in here, and we'll go to the mesh emitter and drag it in there. And then we hit play on this, and we're going to see particles flying off the plane, which is what we want. So let's turn the plane off, and let's immediately up the particle count, because these go quite fast. And like I said, these are heavy and they do get slow, and I don't know if I'm finding bugs or flaws in the particle system in their current state, but I'm going to show you some workarounds if we do happen to hit those bugs, because they were slightly difficult to work around, especially when it came to caching and retiming and stuff. Next up, let's go to properties. I'm actually just going to jump that count to 100,000. We'll go to properties. We're going to set the speed to about -60. And then if we set the direction, we'll keep this on normal for a second. We don't want it on normal, we want it on radial. So all the particles are moving to the middle of the mesh emitter. And having all the particles spawning in on this emitter is quite important, and we'll go over that a little bit more later. But now we've kind of got the emitter set up, let's add a couple of forces. So we'll add a data mapper, wherever it is there. We'll add a data mapper, we'll change it to the radius. We'll do like 0.3 just now, set the life to about 90 frames, and we'll just move the top of this spline over a little bit. And then let's go to the emitter, go to properties, and set the radius to 0. So by this point, if you followed the other tutorials, you're probably kind of beginning to understand the general workflow of what we're doing here with these particles. And then we'll go to the particle group and go to draw radius 0.001. So if you follow the tutorials that I've been doing, just like I mentioned, you're going to be kind of getting used to the stuff we're doing now. It's going to feel a little bit more natural. Let's dive straight into this. And as you can imagine, what we're going to be using is a follow spline. So I put this in the particle group. We're going to add a circle. We're going to change this to XZ on the axis. And you can keep this at 200 centimeters for now. We can maybe bring it down a little bit. But we're going to drop that in the follow spline. we're going to change this to guide, and immediately we're going to kind of get the beginnings of the effect that we want. So again, if you follow the other tutorials, you might know some of the settings that we have to follow here. So let's bring down the attract strength. But what we want is you see how this circle's cutting off here? That's the effect radius. So these particles aren't getting pulled in as aggressively as we want because of that effect radius. So we want to bring that up, because you can see if we don't bring it all the way up, it doesn't quite cover the edges. We want to bring that up just until it covers everything. Now all the particles are swirling in. And we're going to bring down that attract strength. We're going to bring down that follow strength. And we'll bring down the mix in a second. It's not super important yet. The reason for that is because we need some turbulences. So we'll add one turbulence. We'll set the scale to about 4% with the strength on 5. And then we'll add another one. We'll set the scale to about 7 with the strength on 8. Just kind of random numbers here, but we want it quite small. And if we turn off the follow spline for a second, we'll see the effects of these turbulences a little bit more. Maybe not. But either way, we'll keep duplicating them. We'll set another one to about 14. Now it's getting more visible. We can actually maybe just increase the scale of that second one a little bit. And then we'll make another one, and we'll make this one quite a bit bigger, around 40%. That's going to add some real kind of waviness to it. And I'm going to up my timeline here to 150 frames. And you can see now we've kind of basically got the effect, so something that seemed really complex is pretty much there. But we have much work to do. So let's save this project file. And I will put this project file on my tutorial along with some of my own project files. Like I mentioned, if you're one of the first 5, you will get it for free for the first month. And if you hit it in the first hour, you'll get it for 50% off. And that's every project file I've ever posted on my Patreon, must I remind you. Plus every tutorial. I mean, they're better than the project files, right? The tutorials. I hope so. So we've pretty much got what we want now, but we're going to add some color. So let's add a color mapper. And let's just set this going like blue to white or something. We'll maybe add more colors into it. We'll set it to 90 frames. Blue to white. It's kind of just because I know I'm not really going to probably use the color very much. I think with this render, the way you kind of want to extrapolate the color anyway is just having it kind of pull up in the turbulent bits. I mean, you can add more colors in here and kind of get more rhythm going through it if you want to. But it is going to kind of seem a bit one-dimensional. But there's another setup later on where the color flows much nicer, so I will go over that too. That's looking pretty good. What we can do is up the count. So let's up the count to 500,000, say, and have a little look at that. And already, we've really got the effect. And I'm probably going to use Octane as well today. If you want to know how to do it in Redshift, just go to my first particle tutorial. The links to them will be in the description. First particle tutorial from the Christmas calendar this month. It's they're really not varying very much between the two, but there's reasons I like to use Octane with this. I'll go over that. So we're probably going to spend most of our time at this top view now. Focal length on 135. But I probably want to change the parameters of this plane. So we'll change this to 1000. We'll change this to 1400. And that's just going to give us a bit more breathing room there. But let's have a look at some things we can change and how we can art direct this simulation now, because the simulation's pretty much set up. And although this is a pretty complex tutorial, just like I mentioned in my complex particle tutorial the other day, this isn't really complex so much because of the setup. It's just more because of the things we're going to have to deal with. These renders are difficult to render out in Octane, and they're slow and they're annoying. Again, it really depends on your particle count. I mean, I was trying to render 4 million, so I'm kind of asking for issues at that point. And a lot of the stills I showed you did have 4 million particles, but nonetheless, these can be a little bit tricky. And I ran into a lot of issues where after you cache, it would get slower. And then you're kind of finding some instances of workflow difficulty in the particles at the minute, because as I went over in my tutorial the other day, when you cache, you lose all the scale of the particles. It doesn't show it in the viewport anymore. It's still there. The data is still there, but it doesn't show it in the viewport. So when it comes to retiming that, it's a bit difficult, but we'll go over that. So some of the settings we can change here. The follow strength. If you remember, if you've seen the tutorial the other day, this is the rotation. So should we turn that off? The particles are still going to fly into the spline, but they're not really going to rotate. The turbulences are kind of going to flow them around. And what that can do is bring us to another modifier, which would be a rotation. So we'll drop that in and we'll add a spherical field. And we'll increase the size of this. And let's set it to force and set it to about 100 for now. And what we should see, let's crank this up more. Maybe set it to acceleration actually, that might work a bit better. Do I have to rotate it? If we rotate it up 90 degrees, that might help. That seems to be doing it. Okay, yeah, so you need to just put 90 on the P here. I didn't think you had to do that when it was at this orientation, but apparently you do. Oh, I was getting a bit laggy. I'm just going to drop the gun a little bit because it is getting laggy. Make sure that doesn't go to per frame. You'll thank yourself for it. Just like I accidentally smacked it there. So let's do 500. Now we've got it really, really spinning around, right? Without that follow strength, which is basically follow rotation, right? We can put in a rotation here and have it spin with this. And why is this cool? Is it probably mixes with the turbulences a little bit better. It makes it, I don't know, it just makes it different, right? It's something you can do. I would probably kind of have it in the middle there, so it's swirling the particles that are within this sort of ridge of turbulences. And this is what I did do on my initial renders. I mean, 500 is way too much, but so is 400, 300. Acceleration may be better, just in the way it handles the speed of the particles. It's less linear, right? So we've got that. We can use that as well. I would actually set this to about 100, and then I would still give it some follow strength. This is what I'm just going to do for the tutorial today. And with the attract strength, you know, the more we crank this up, the more they're going to get pulled in at speed, but it's going to affect the strength of the turbulences, so you'd have to compensate by changing the strength of the turbulences. But if we bring that all the way down, we get tons of rotation, but we don't get as much of that zipping to the middle. So we get this like beautiful ocean of particles swirling around in a circle almost. And if you really bring both of them down, you get this like lovely surface of particles. And the caveat with this is that there's no depth to it, and that's the second setup I'm going to show you a little bit later. So I would find a middle ground with both of these for now, for this setup, and you get these kind of lovely swirling particles. And you know, the more you bring down the attract strength and the follow strength, the more those turbulences are going to show themselves and show through. I would bring a little bit of attract fall off as well. That's going to help bring back in some of the turbulence on the edges. And of course we have the mix value now as well. I usually sit with this around 35%. We bring that down, we get a lot more of the turbulences as well. It's seeming a bit aggressive right now because my attract strength and follow strength were set quite low. But this is kind of more of the value I would go for usually. Something a little bit like this. And I like the aggression of this as well. I like how turbulent the particles are as they're hitting. Maybe just a couple of tweaks there. Maybe 40%. Definitely want as much turbulence as I can get on the edges. But it can be difficult sometimes with a count of like 200,000 because you're really going to see so much more on that higher count. And it's going to give you a much better indication of what you're working with. I am going to turn off that spherical field in the viewport though. I'm also going to turn off my world axis. You can see here we've got some really stunning particles. Now, what if you want to get rid of that circle in the middle? So you don't want them kind of emitting from a circle. Well, it's pretty simple really. We decrease the size of the circle. The smallest you can go with this is 1. And we may have to increase that attract radius a little bit, but effect radius is called. You increase that a little bit more. That's going to help with things. So we're not getting that weirdness in the edges. But now you're going to get all these particles swirling to the middle, and you're not really going to get that hole. Although I would try to prioritize the turbulences in this kind of instance, just so you get something a bit more like this. But you're still going to kind of feel the rigidness of them hitting. And you can get around that a bit more, like I said, with the attract strength. You bring down that attract strength, and let's turn off the rotation with this. And then we'd have to bring it up a little bit more. Didn't really notice how much that rotation was blocking things off there. But you get something a little bit more like this, where I'll show the image up on the screen where I did this look here, is they're all kind of flowing into the middle. And just like I said before, you can then have them kind of oscillating around in circles if you want. Again, just really cool effects here. This stuff looks absolutely awesome. What I'm going to do anyway, let's set the radius to something like 150, and let's set these values to probably where they were. We want them a little bit more aggressive. Just kind of where I was before. So something like this probably. We've got these really aggressive turbulences on the side, which I like, these thick lines. And we'll just increase the follow strength a bit and the attract radius a bit. And I'm pretty happy with that, I feel like, although I may make this just a tad bigger, like 170. But yeah, you can play with these values however you like. One thing I also want to mention is if we come out the camera, you know, we've got quite a bit of thickness here from the turbulences, but you can bring up this circle as well, and they're going to pull towards the circle. I went over this the other day as well when we were dealing with the follow spline, and that's probably going to give you a bit more dimension when it comes to the lighting, because we're working a flat plane here without really any thickness. You know, it's not a box, it's not a volume of particles. Having that kind of pull up here is going to add more shadows around different places, which is going to help when it comes to making your render look good. So as of right now, this particle setup is actually pretty much done. The other thing we could do is potentially add some flocking. You have to be careful because it's so slow, but we can do some cool things with this. If I was to do anything, it would probably be that velocity alignment strength I discovered and a bit of cohesion. Decrease that separation radius as well. I mean, look at that, that's so slow. But it'd probably be something like that to get some like clumping, you know. Maybe take a look at these values if you want to get that clumping. I just sort of eyeballed that and smashed some things together, but I would probably go for something a bit like that. It looks like sand. That looks really cool. So you can keep it in the scene and turn it off. For now, I'm not really bothered about it. I think this looks really, really cool. The other thing we're going to want to add is a spin modifier. So we'll come to modifier and add a spin, and we'll set this to something like 50 degrees and leave that there. And this is going to be important when we're rendering, so all the particles are at a random rotation. Now, before we go into Octane, I'm going to show you the other setup quickly. That's pretty much it for this one. Looks really, really cool. It's actually much more simple than you'd expect. It took me a couple hours of playing to kind of get this right and figure it out. It was kind of in my head, and it was something I made before, and I thought, how would I do that with these particles? So the fact that I figured it out, I'm quite chuffed, and I'm very happy to make a tutorial on it. I'm going to save this and save this incrementally, and then I'm going to save it incrementally again. And I'm going to show you this second setup. So with this mesh emitter, if we turn this off and instead we grab a normal basic emitter, right? And this is the second setup. You don't necessarily have to follow along. This setup can be a little bit slower. Let's set the kind of same values. So 1400 by, what was that? 1000 was it? Or 800? It was the plane, so it was 1000, yeah. Set the size Y to something like 25. So we've got this like tank of particles, right? We're going to do the same things before. Let's bring this up to 200,000 and go to properties, set this to radial and set this to something like -60. Set the radius to 0 and then play through this. And now we've, well, actually it's created another particle group. So I'm going to delete that, go to properties and drag it in this particle group. So now we've kind of got this like thickness of particles, right? And it's a little bit difficult to see here, but at the side you can really see it. And that would help your render in some ways, because now you've got this depth to it. And that gives it the feeling of like fluid in a tank. And if we up that count to something like 800,000 and play through it, it's going to feel quite a bit thicker. For a lot of my renders, I didn't really feel that this made a difference to like those top-down renders, but the thickness is there should we want it. So if we mess with like the attract strength and stuff now, we actually get vastly different effects to an extent. The colors kind of behave a bit differently, and the turbulences kind of behave a bit differently. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does look really, really cool. And I was kind of doing this cool render with it, where I was getting these particles almost looking like they're kind of burning. You know, something like that. There's just, those strands that we're getting are now kind of happening underneath as well. I think that's really cool. So again, I'm probably going to leave this basic emitter in the scene, but that's something to think about as well if you want to do it. If we were to come up to a emission rate of about 1.8 million, and you see now with that, and we take a little look at that, that's really, really cool. So that's with that thickness. We have a look here from the side. We've got all that thickness in the particles now. Really nice setup. That is just crazy that we can do that in Cinema 4D. It still blows my mind. Still absolutely blows my mind. I mean, the amount of detail here. All these little turbulent bits poking up, and it's just so cool. But the age of the color, I haven't actually messed with this, so this is going to be a a bit of experimenting. You know, the color here, you know, it's so kind of gradiating in. It's so cool on the turbulences, but on the edges it's not, and it doesn't really matter because we're kind of sat in the middle here. But I would be interested to see how this would look with a velocity magnitude and messing with these values. See, it doesn't actually look as good because the particle's on a flat plane. And it just kind of looks like a noise printed on the top. It's not moving through the particles so much. Maybe distance traversed is a bit better. Yeah, that's cool. So what this does, you see this in a lot of different particle systems, is as the particles travel a farther distance, they change their color. So that's really cool. With something like that, I'd kind of imagine you want more colors in there. Blue, orange, purple. That's cool, but it feels like it's in reverse. Either way, this is just some experimentation, some things to show you, some things to think about, different angles you can take it. What I want to do for now anyway, we'll come back to that first color mapper, and we'll come back to that mesh emitter, is I want to stay on this setup. And we did mess with that follow spline, didn't we? So we want to kind of up that a little bit. And get back to where we want it to be. Yep, that looks cool. Nice swirly particles. Awesome. So what we're going to do is, before we just jump into Octane, we'll turn on that rotation as well. And we will bring up these three, the ones that aren't in use, and put them in a group. And call them MISC or whatever, I don't know. Put these in a group, call them turbulences. And then put this circle in the follow spline. Data mapper, call this size. Color mapper, call this color. Call the rotation there. Call the size there. You can put the plane in the mesh emitter. That helps neaten everything up. Now we can understand what we're looking at a bit more. You can save that. Save it again. And that's a pretty darn cool render. We may mess with parts of the simulation again once we're in Octane, but for now, this looks pretty cool. Just being wary of that attract strength, because I really like to see a lot of these kind of spliny leading bits coming in from the outside. But with all that being said, let's go and make some renders of this now and see what kind of stuff we can get going. I failed to mention at the beginning of the tutorial, but all of this is going to be completely within Octane. Same if you were to do Redshift. None of this is going to be using external assets. We can do this entire render just straight off the bat. So this is actually sketchy visuals from the future here. I was just editing the tutorial and the viewport lag was so bad that you couldn't actually see what was going on. And what we're starting here is just this is just the beginning of the Octane period segment, and we were doing some lighting. So I'm just going to re-record it for 30 seconds and then cut you back to the old clip, because I don't want you following that laggy, jittery piece of footage. So we're just going to take the Octane live viewer and we're going to pause it for a second, and we're going to add in a cloner, and then we're going to add in a cube, set it to about 4 centimeters. Let's turn off the plane just so it doesn't show up in Octane. Let's put the cube in the cloner. Let's change this to object and then put the particle group in there. Then change it to multi-instance. That's quite important. And then, I mean, you can leave it on in the viewport if you want. Although I would change this to matrix or points, just so it's a little bit quicker. And then bring on the particle scale. I would duplicate a bunch of these cubes till we've got a bunch of them. Thank God I've got this old version of the scene, you know. And I saved incrementally in the tutorial so I can go right into where you were. Otherwise, this would have been very difficult. So now we can get Octane running. So we will just lock this live viewer and get that going. And as you can see, we've got our particles. Now I do want to warn you, this can have a tendency to be quite heavy. Really quite heavy. which is probably why that piece of recording was lagging. So we're going to drop in an area light. And I'm just going to take it a little bit slow in case it lags again. We'll drop in a texture environment. And we'll make that black. We'll turn that off in the viewport. And then we're actually just going to middle mouse click. And we're going to go to this right side view. Because all I really did with the lighting, if it'll let me zoom back here, is I didn't really change any settings in the light. I just pushed it to the side and pushed it up. But what I did do was add a target, of course. I usually do that first. And we'll target the particle group just so it's facing our particles. Press W in the keyboard here. Drop this down. And I added a second light as well at the bottom so you can duplicate this light and move it over here. A little bit further away. And of course, the lower down these lights are, the more shadows you're going to get. And that was pretty much it for the lighting. And then at the end of this piece, I just added a universal material. And now I can send you back to my original recording. I feel like if you're doing this in Octane, just be careful with your inputs. Let Octane update before you spam it with another input or something. So, you know, plug in this albedo here. And you can see there was a pretty nice feedback. But we just made this a kind of sandy color. Crank up the roughness. That was pretty much the material. Can't say I did much else. And kind of find that sandy color. And then let's do some work on the camera. So I'm going to add my LUT. So we've got the LUT in there. We'll add highlight compression. We'll drop the exposure. And we'll drop the gamma. Till we get something that looks pretty cool. And I'm going to add a bit of vignetting. I'm going to add a bit more saturation. I'll play with these values again. And we'll come to post-processing and we'll add a little bit of bloom. That's pretty much it. So I would say the render right now is feeling pretty good. The whole setup of this is quite simple, but where this gets a little bit more tricky and a little bit more painful and in the trenches is going to be dealing with the particle count. So right now we're on 600,000, but we're on about frame 60 something, so we're probably on more like 1.2 million or whatever. I'm going to up this particle count to something like 1.5 million. We'll play it through, and this will really boost the way this looks a little bit, and it will fill in the edges a little bit here more, thicken everything up, and then with that we can make the particle size a little bit smaller. And I actually wouldn't mind kind of making the hole in the middle here a little bit bigger as well. So we're going to pause Octane, we're going to turn off the cloner, and to get that hole a bit bigger in the middle, I believe that it would be the attract strength that's going to play into that a little bit. And on the size here, just kind of shifting this along a little bit as well should help. And then in the follow spline, really just kind of messing with a couple of these values. I mean, having the circle a bit bigger helps as well, but that's probably generated enough, but we'll see. Let's, like I said, up that count to 1.5 million and play through it now, and this is where Octane does tend to get a little bit more slow. And this is what's nice about these, is even on 1.5 million particles, it's running pretty quick, and Octane does have a tendency to, I want to say, maybe be a little bit slower in instances like this. But really what we should do is just lean into caching. It does seem to help Octane kind of loading up and dealing with things, and it helps a little bit with the kind of constant crashing that you're going to find with a render as heavy as this. And the cache, the great thing about it as well is the cache isn't going to take too long. Before we go into that, we could probably get away with adding an extra substep, but at the same time, with all these kind of like long streaks we've kind of got coming off here, and it's kind of got these little lines in it, if you actually like that, I kind of like it in some of the renders. So I was doing a lot of the renders with the substeps in one. If you actually like that, then I would suggest sticking with it. But like I've mentioned in the other tutorials, when we do change that substep, it's going to change the behavior of these turbulences a little bit. So if you want that extra detail, add that substep, then mess with your forces and whatnot. But for now, I'm actually just going to keep it on 1. And then we can go to the particle group and we can cache this. And now we've got our 1.5 million particles. It's actually about 3 million at this frame. But this looks pretty cool. What I would probably do a little bit later on is actually just change the lifespan to about 90 frames, so we're sticking at that 1.5 million mark. But nonetheless, this looks pretty cool as it is. A couple of things I want to make changes to though. Let's pause Octane a second. We've got this cloner, right? And the reason this cloner is cool in Octane is because we're in the MoGraph suite. We can add whatever we want and actually affect the particles. So we could add, for example, a plane effector. We go to the parameter, turn off the position, enable the scale. We could set this to like -0.4, for example. And now we've got like a mass controller for the scale of the particles. And we could even do this again. We could add a random effector. Turn off the position, go to the scale, uniform and absolute, so we get that single parameter. We set it to like 0.4. So now we've got the particles kind of on a bit of a randomized scale, and we're controlling this overall scale with this. If we hit render on that, as you can see, we've got a little bit of a different effect. You can't massively, actually, I think the random, it doesn't isolate as many particles as you want it to in most cases. It's cool to have, and it's cool to know that we can do it. I still think that I found in my renders it was better to just use the plane to kind of bring down the scale of all of them, and that way it's just a little bit quicker. And then still take that top cube and up the scale of that individually. I reckon rather than using a random, using a plane and adding a random field effector to that is probably the better way to go. But you can see here now we've kind of got that nice mixture of small and big particles. You could maybe just bring the scale of these down to like 0.5. And I think they generally do just look a little bit better when they're smaller and this kind of high particle count. So messing with the camera, we can make this render probably a little bit lighter. I want to say it's a bit dark, so we can make it a bit lighter. Add a bit more saturation maybe. It's a bit too yellow now though. And let's maybe punch the camera in just a bit. Just because on the edges there we were kind of losing a bit of detail. And I want more contrast, but I want it lighter. Something like that, I reckon. Not much else to do now. That's pretty much it. We'll go over adding the color. So if we were to add the color here, all we would do is add an instance color and add a gradient. We would drag the cloner into that instance color, plug that in the gradient, and then plug that into the albedo. If we come to the gradient here, and for example, we were to do like a kind of that sandy color mixed with a red, and blend these together. As you can see here, we've got that white color on top, so we would just be aiming to push that white color out. But there's a problem here. I forgot to mention this. Now we've got that plane effector in there is under the parameter that's overriding the base cloner color, which is picking up from the particles with this field's color. So we would have to go to the color mode on the plane effector and turn that off to get our particle color to show through. And you can see now that's showing through. So that red's probably a bit much. Let me go for more of an orange, more of this kind of color. And we just want to blend those colors together. Screw it, let's do like a blue. Let's do like a blue and a purple. Let's just change it completely. Or we could actually do what we've got on the background. That blue looks awesome. Let's do a blue and a white. A little bit of a darker blue. And you can see that gradient, it's a bit over the top. I think, you spacing these out is probably the better way to go. But I kind of want to reverse these. I kind of want the blue to be white and the white to be blue. So the whole thing in blue actually just looks awesome. See if we can get some of that white in there. I just don't want that cut off around the edges. I think something like that is fine enough. You kind of get the point of it. I think maybe bringing down in the color, bringing down this a little bit can help. But really you've just got to, depends where you are in the timeline, and you've kind of got to tweak the gradient a lot. I think I might stick with that blue for the rest of the tutorial though, because it looks awesome. So let's discuss some different camera angles. Just create a second one there, and this one's optimized for that first color we went over, so I'm just kind of adding a bit more contrast for this one. That looks so cool. Really big fan of that. We're going to add another camera here. And to get some cool close-ups, really we're just zooming in here, and kind of similar to our particles the other day. And just zoom in on a random point. Rotate a little bit or something. Similar to our particles the other day, this is really going to come to life when we add depth of field. And yesterday in the X particles tutorial that we did, we really saw the effects of that. So I changed the wrong setting there. We're going to set this to 50, 2, 3, set this to 0.1. And you can see we've got this nice bokeh in the background. Maybe want to mess with the camera values for this individual angle as well. We've got some cool renders there. And we can just duplicate that camera and find different camera angles, basically. That's usually the gist with particles, right? It's just duplicate cameras and move them about and see what you can find that looks cool. And going up the top here like that looks really cool. And I think it's shots like this where what we experimented earlier with taking out that hole in the middle can kind of be useful, because I feel like in an angle like this it kind of affects the composition slightly. Even that out a bit more. Something like that looks really cool. So you can kind of get the point. Just move your camera about and find some cool angles. That's pretty much it for Octane and making these particles look good. The last thing I really want to go over is just how do we cache and retime this. This simulation thankfully looks quite good just on its own, but retiming is really what brings the simulation to life, and you really want to be able to do it, and it's just going to reanimate everything. It just looks so cool. Like when you're making particle simulations, please try and retime it because it makes it look so much better. But there's a couple of things we have to go over to get that right. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to then save it incrementally again. So what we'll do is we'll pause Octane and we'll turn off the cloner. And if we play through this, even with the cache, you can see it's actually not that bad of a speed, but it's quite difficult to retime that. So what we're going to do here actually is come to the emission, and this is just for kind of getting what we need to do to retime this is we need to be able to see quite a fluent real-time kind of feedback. There is kind of solutions where we can retime it a little bit, send it to a viewport picture viewer up here, which we'll probably do anyway. But what I would suggest doing is bringing the countdown to something around 400,000. And if we turn off this cache mode for a second and we play through this, deselect this, we can see that that's really fast now. So then let's just cache this on 400,000 particles. But like I said before, let's actually go to the lifetime and change it to 90 frames. And that way we're staying at 400,000. We're not going 400,000, 800,000, 1.2 million, 1.6 million. We're just staying at 400,000 the whole time, which is really, really nice. That's what we want, a bit more predictable. So let's cache this. Now if I play through that, of course we've lost the scale, but this feedback is pretty much good enough for time remapping. Now, if you've ever retimed in a line book or a simulation, you may be familiar with this remapping curve. And if we select both these points and change it to the point type to soft, so soft, now what we can do is retime this. Now at the beginning, they're kind of spawning in. So what I would do is maybe lift this up a little bit, right? So we're kind of starting a little bit into the simulation, something like this. And then holding control, I would add another point and I'd maybe have it start quite fast and then go slow. You have to be careful here because it will get very slow. We don't want it too slow. And now it's going to start really fast, slow down, and then slowly speed up again towards the end. We just want to make sure that doesn't get too slow, but also remembering this is going like, this does make the feedback a little bit slower when we retime this, but this is going like 1 frame per second, you know, so it's not always a good gauge. So like I mentioned before, a good way to get around that is to come up here and create another render setting. You could call this one render, for example, and we could call this one VP for viewport. And then we come into this one, set it to like 1280 by 720, set it to all frames, change this to viewport render, go to viewport renderer, filter, load preset, animation, and then just disable the save. It doesn't really matter. We're just using this to further art direct things and make sure it all looks good. And then you can just send that up there to the picture viewer, and then it's going to render through it at about the same speed we were playing back through. And then you can just watch the speed of it. So you can see now it comes in fast and slows down. It's so cool. Oh, that gets me so excited. And you can see, you can just imagine that with the color animated on there as well. This looks so cool. I can just imagine that with these blue particles. And I'll kind of let that render out while I discuss a couple of things. That's kind of it for the tutorial. I think I've covered everything I pretty much want to cover. I would have liked to go over redshift, but really it feels like diminishing returns because it's just the same process. What I would do is reference my other particle rendering tutorial because it's all the same stuff. You're just putting a Redshift render tag on it and dropping in a bunch of cubes and putting a simple material on it with a bit of a color. I think it's fine not to cover that for today. It really is quite simple. It's so nice that we can get such complicated results so easily now with a really small amount of modifiers, really not much complex particle knowledge. The difficulties with this is it is slow and you kind of need to learn the workarounds. If you don't cache it and you come up to a high particle count, your Octane's going to start crashing on you. I don't think Redshift would really do it as much, but the Octane Live Viewer does seem to be a little bit snappier with the particles sometimes. So really it's just complete personal preference which one you want to use. One thing I want to discuss as well is if you were going to send any of these renders out as a still to the picture viewer, and this is the same for Redshift as well, absolutely cache the particles first. For some reason, whenever I would try to send a render to the picture viewer and I didn't cache the particles, it just seemed to perpetually, when it's like loading into the picture viewer and it's loading up the render, it just seemed to do that endlessly and eventually crash. And even with it cached, the simulation cached, sometimes after it would take 10 minutes to get an image to show up. So, just be mindful of that. You're going to be caching this simulation a lot kind of often and uncaching it again and doing different things with it. But for the most part, it's a relatively simple setup. And we've got this completely played out now. We can see it's going to start speeding up again towards the end. So it comes in, slows down, and then slowly gets faster. And then you'd maybe want that at the end a little bit quicker. You would want that spike a little bit quicker. And then at the end there, it's going to reference the speed of the beginning more and it's going to kind of shoot off faster. I would be careful with the offset. If you want to move away from the start, just raise up at this point. Don't mess with the offset because then it bleeds that into the alembic retime and ends up shortening the animation or like just making it really slow. Like the speed doesn't reference what you're looking at as much. It's kind of hard to explain, but I just wouldn't mess with the offset. So that's pretty much it for today's tutorial. Hopefully it's all added up quite well for you and you're capable of making these cool renders whether you're in Octane or Redshift and you understand messing with the full display modifier and getting different results and how we can tighten this up or get rid of the rotation and do a bunch of different things with it. I really hope it makes sense. I really hope it's been laid out clearly for you today. And be sure to go to Patreon, get these project files, check out the other tutorials. Like I said, the first 5 people are going to get my Patreon for free on that link in the description for an hour after this tutorial goes live. Maybe I'll make it a bit longer, but for an hour after this tutorial goes live as well. If you miss the first 5 spaces, you'll still be able to get the Patreon for 50% off. Really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Much more to come the rest of the month. Definitely send me and tag me in all these renders that you make. I'm excited to see what you guys do with this one specifically because it's just really quite a jaw-dropping and nice render to look at. And with all that being said, I shall see you tomorrow for another cool tutorial. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube. Things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm. Breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.